suddenly education didn't really matter. All the stuff that we were actually meant to be about didn't matter at all. It was all, and it was always this thing of, oh, we've got to protect ourselves, or like protect the adult. It was using children as a shield.
Anti-vaxxer, far-right fascist, granny killer, being told I'm responsible for killing their grandfather, etc., etc.
The COVID vaccine rollout to children, which I'm still blown away that I'm the only head or school principal out of more than 20,000 to actually publicly question that. And there are loads who agree with my stance, by the way, but they are too scared to say anything about it.
There's 1 million people all turning around to you and saying yes. Still say no if you feel that is the answer you want to give.
The Lost Generation, or the Children of the Revolution. Today we're going to be talking about the impact of the COVID-19 policies and restrictions upon a generation of children and students throughout the education system. And I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic guests today. Mike Fairclough, who was the only UK-serving head teacher who publicly questioned the policies, lockdowns, masking and vaccination of children, whilst Monty, our second guest, was one of the most outspoken students to publicly question these policies, starting at just 14 years old. Now, we'll be speaking to both of our guests today from the perspectives of someone who was a teenager at the time, expected to follow these policies without question, and also from the perspective of the education system, from an educational authority who was expected to impose these policies. So we're looking at both sides of the conversation today. Now, Monty, I'd like to start with you. You were 14 when the pandemic was declared in 2020, and 18 by the time restrictions were finally lifted in full. You've resisted many of the COVID policies that were imposed upon your school in Lincolnshire during the pandemic. Could you describe what it was like? How did the teachers and your fellow students react? Tell us about your experience as a 14-year-old when this happened.
Of course. So lockdown started when I was 14, and very quickly it was all a bit of a joke. Is the kind of that was the consensus at school. Everyone thought, a couple of weeks will be off, and it was as simple as that. If someone got a slight cough, they'd go home straight away because, well, kids always want to get off school, don't they? But when lockdowns came in, we went home, and throughout lockdown, I didn't really do lockdown very much, I'm not going to lie to you. But on my return to school, which is the most important sort of memories I had, is the way I describe it. I was unprepared. I really was, because I'd lived in this bubble within my family of just sort of thinking that this is quite just silly and not something that we're going to engage in much. Other students didn't behave the same way. And when we went back into school, I was not prepared for the level of kind of cognitive dissonance. I mean, there were circles on the floor. There were signs everywhere. We were told that, obviously, about the whole 2-meter distances. We were given very authoritarian assemblies, being told if we don't wear a mask, we are putting people's lives at risk. Bear in mind, I'm 14, but obviously, secondary school, you start at 11 years old. You're very, very young. And the impact that I could see this having on other students was just immense. It was quite terrifying how I watched my teachers go from kind of my friends, people I respected, people I looked up to my enemy, who were calling me out in the classroom, smirking at me. Like my maths teacher, for example, I brought up Sweden, and obviously he's a maths teacher, so he sort of should know something about stats. But yeah, he smirked at me, he smiled at me, and told me to go away and do some proper research. And it's just crazy to think that they're meant to be my guardian, they're meant to be my sort of protector for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. And yet that just disappeared on the basis that I was killing people's grannies, was the consensus. So that was my initial entry into education just after lockdown.
I mean, how did it feel being called something like a granny killer at such a young age? I mean, how did you respond to that? Yeah,
so when I went into the, we called it the yard or playground, I was grouped by about 7 boys. And they knew my opinions because I was very quick to be outspoken about it. I didn't see it as that controversial. See, I wasn't so sensitive about the way I worded things. I just knew it was just utter nonsense. So when that happened, they clubbed around me, and yet the way you feel is not nice. As you know, there's enough sort of Boise hierarchy within school enough, as it is. But when you implicate things like anti-vaxxer, far-right fascist, granny killer, being told I'm responsible for killing their grandfather, etc., yeah, it makes you feel awful. But I did have tremendous support from my mum and dad. Like, if I wasn't given that sort of support and protection to go home to, it would have been a completely different story. But I could go in like a warrior for the day and then go home and relax. So I had that kind of recharge station. But no, to answer your question, not enjoyable. It's not something you should be doing when you're 14. You're a kid. You're kind of entering the peak of your youth and to have fun. And instead, I was using the majority of my energy to fight back against this horrific narrative.
And Mike, how does this compare to yourself? You know, during this time, you were being asked to impose these restrictions. Does what Monty shared sound familiar, or did you have a different experience?
Yeah. So as you were talking, I've just pulled up on something that the children's campaign group Us for Them put on Twitter X this morning, and it was a blast from the past. It was Julia Hartley Brewer on the 28th of November 2021, saying, "Tonight, just hours before millions of children are to be forced to wear face masks in communal areas at school, here's the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, at a huge awards bash with teachers, and not a mask in bloody sight," she says. Hypocrisy, hashtag mask theatre, etc. And this was my biggest problem. It was the complete blatant hypocrisy. So you would have adults going out at the weekend and seeing friends, and in fact, some of the most ardent kind of lockdown sort of advocates I discovered later would say to me, "Oh yeah, I'd still have my hairdresser over to my house because I knew where she'd been," that kind of thing. There's this sort of very sort of like superior, elitist, sort of like horrible kind of feeling. But with regards to my experience, going back to like very, very quickly in 2020, when it first all kicked off with Boris Johnson saying many of us will lose loved ones. I remember where I was driving my car. I'd seen the reports coming out of China and Italy, etc. And at this point, it hadn't been declared that COVID wasn't an indiscriminate virus which would take out, you know, people of all ages and children, etc., etc. So I was really worried at the beginning, and I said to my parents before the official school closures, you know, if you want to keep your kids at home till we know what's going on, do so. And some of them did. About 5 days later, schools reopened. Obviously, most schools opened partially. So I had 150 out of my 365 children in the school, 30 out of my 60 members of staff. Everyone was a bit like, oh, you know, what's kind of going on and that kind of stuff. But then within about 3 weeks of that, Chris Whitty and others said, children are at extremely low risk of serious illness from COVID, and so is the vast majority of the population. So that's when I started to question the merits of school closures and lockdowns as in general, and began to kind of speak my mind about it. And that's when I came actually against the first bout of, you know, complaints and all of that kind of stuff. But I noticed that within the education sector, there are those who completely buy and bought the official narrative hook, line and sinker. And I say buy in the present tense because it depends whichever the latest one is. And there are loads of people who aren't within the education sector, who are adults, who are teachers, who don't think critically and will just absorb whatever they're told to do. Sorry, that's my phone falling over. And then there are other people who know that at the time who were very skeptical about things, and particularly when it came out with regards to the vaccination of children against COVID-19, and didn't like the idea of it going on, but were too scared to speak out. So there's a lot of self-censoring that goes on. But from the sort of adult teacher perspective, there was a massive amount of pressure put on by the unions in particular to, quote, protect their members and then a lot of adults who, teachers, teaching assistants, etc., who just didn't think critically about it, didn't do their own research, but as I say, acted in a contradictory and hypocritical way, as I just demonstrated with that enormous. I mean, looking at the pictures now, it was packed, that celebration teaching awards, and no distancing, no masks, none of the theatre, but apparently that was okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Now, Monty, how do you respond to what Mike's shared? How does it feel hearing that from a former head teacher, which we'll talk about later on?
It's very refreshing. You mentioned the hypocrisy, which is the main thing you're talking about, and not just hypocrisy in terms of how the teachers behave, but hypocrisy in terms of rules that are enforced. I mean, forget about how useless masks are as a whole. Let's assume they work for a second. Let's assume they're great. Well, when I went into school and I said to my dad, I said, Dad, they're going to bring masks into school. He went, no, they won't, son. I went, they're going to do it. And a week later, lo and behold, the masks came in. I went, okay, they've brought them in. But you don't have to wear them in a classroom, but you do if you're walking through the corridor. I was like, right, okay. Now, we were put into little bubbles, so the bubbles explain that. But then they said, okay, you do have to wear a mask in the classroom, but only if you get up to go somewhere. So if you stood up and you go to the toilet or something, you have to put a mask on to go into the empty corridor while everyone's in lesson. And so, just in case you're facing someone. Then they turned around and said, okay, no, now you've got to put masks on all in the classroom, and everyone was wearing a mask. And then they said, and you've got to wear them outside. And then they were everywhere. But I mean, we're talking, these rules got so ridiculous. They used to, if I was to shout or sing or something, you'd be told to stop because too many particles were coming out of your mouth. It got quite warm. When we went back, it was quite warm in the classroom. So he said, can we put a fan on? No, you can't put the fan on because you'll be blowing the particles around the room too much. I mean, these are just utterly complete. These are from science teachers. It was actually in my science class, completely unscientific. And the hypocrisy with the rules was just constant, and it was obvious. That's the thing; it was obvious. The students and the teachers knew it, and yet they still subscribe to it. And I always use this as a really good example. It's another example of hypocrisy. It was my history teacher who I'm not sure she was. I'm not sure she liked me very much, but she was teaching Hitler's rise to power, which is interesting because usually at school you look at Hitler during his reign, but in this case it was how he got there. And it was just fascinating to see her stood at the front of the class wearing a mask, with all the students wearing a mask, with posters everywhere saying hands, face, space, and to be telling me about how Hitler used propaganda and sort of almost like nudge theory, as we discussed it today, to sort of coerce people into following his rules and ideologies. And I said, well, miss, can you not see how ironic this is? And I was sent out. I was sent to the head of history, and they said, "How can you think you know more than a woman with a history degree?" In which I had to go into those details, and that was another fun one. But yeah, I mean, I could go on and on and on about hypocrisy. One last one I'd say is going to the bathroom. You were given a toilet card because only a certain amount of people were allowed out at that time. So you're given a toilet card. You go to the bathroom. You come back, and you'd have to spray the toilet card with sanitizer. And then you'd have to put the toilet card into a plastic wallet for the next person to use. But they didn't sanitize the sanitizer. So you pick up a dirty sanitized bottle, you sanitize the card, you put it in there, you put the sanitized bottle down, and nothing's changed. It's just utterly ridiculous. And yet everyone just nodded along and subscribed to it. It's just mental.
It's actually frightening, really. So firstly, there's no doubt whatsoever that children and young people had it the worst throughout COVID with regards to the government's COVID response. There's no question of a doubt. And it's interesting that there's very little focus or mention of that in the COVID inquiry, which is currently going on. I think it's absolutely shocking what you had to endure. I mean, it just sounds like, I mean, something that was a blessing in the UK, unlike the US, was that at primary school, children were not asked to wear masks, or rather forced to wear masks. It was secondary school. So that was that was something which I think was a real blessing. Although there were teachers who thought they should be wearing them. But as you say, it's the chilling amount of, let's say, stupidity, which really worries me. So exactly what you said with regards to the inconsistency of wearing masks. Though, in fact, there was the other day I was on the, I mean, I go to London every couple of weeks to see my wife's mum, and on the way back on the train there was this guy wearing a mask, and he was the only there was actually only us and him on the whole train, and he was at the other end. I thought, fair enough, I'm trying to spread the love vibe, didn't want to be too negative, but I was a bit irritated as well. But I was just thought, okay, each to their own, and forgot about it. And then when it was my stop, I stood up, and his mask was off, and he was eating a sausage roll. And it was like exactly that thing, like you say, of like, what? This doesn't make any sense. It's completely absurd. It's like the same thing happened with going into restaurants and all of that kind of stuff. But what I think is really important to look at is what was going on, which we now know more about, is the things like the psychological nudge unit. So, military grade PSYOP, which was enacted on the population. And just as they discovered in, the famous Milgram experiment, where about at least 75% of people who are subjected to that kind of, particularly if it's an authority figure telling you to do something. I do actually think there's a huge amount of merit as well in mass formation psychosis. So, well, if Mrs. Brown is doing it and, the Prime Minister is telling us to do it, then that's what we have to do. It doesn't matter how absurd it is. But I had it easy because although obviously I had a lot of kickbacks and, on that side, it's been a real challenge. But in terms of the restrictions on me, I was allowed to cross bubbles. Do you remember that one? So if you were like the head teacher or the caretaker, you could magically like cross like the bubble between year 3 and year 4, or and somehow nothing would happen. And it was just like, this is stupid. It was utterly ridiculous. But it was kids who were treated the most cruelly. And because, of course, it wasn't just in school time, it was on their way to school and public transport as well. So you could be in a mask for 8 hours a day. And now there's all these reports and studies showing that it actually increased the likelihood of you getting COVID if you were wearing masks. And of course, all the kind of like horrible fungal stuff and all of that kind of thing. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. But the PSYOP the legacy of the PSYOP still lives on, because you still have people who are like, doesn't matter how absurd it is, they are continuing with the, not so much the theatre, but their belief in it, even though it's inconsistent.
I had a teacher actually come up to me and say, and shout, "I've just been told you've been wearing a mask on the bus, but you've not been wearing one at school." And I said, "Well, I can tell you for a fact I've not worn a mask on the bus." But it was the fact that either she was lying or a student had said that, but it was the aggression that was involved. I mean, the thing is, the fact I didn't wear a mask, it's like a visual representation of a strength of character to be able to say I'm not going to wear one. And because of that, teachers then assume, or students then assume, that, well, this guy seems pretty kind of resilient, then we can be quite, aggressive, or maybe not aggressive, but quite forceful with the way we want to approach him. But nevertheless, I went into school, and I can only describe it as sort of a very stoic mindset, was just my main approach. But when you go home and you're sat and you just think, I've got school 5 days a week and this is the majority of my life, and I'm not even educated at this point, I'm just going in to fight. It is, at 15 is when I properly went back and was dealing with all the mandates. It's just grim. I look back on it and it's a really weird paradox, because it's like, I'm so glad that it's made me the sort of man I am today, but I wish it never happened.
So how did it sort of conclude? Did you stay the course, but as this kind of rebel who wouldn't conform, or how did it pan out for you?
So I think that what saved me was the fact that before restrictions came in, I'd built like a really nice rapport with my teachers. So that they knew me before lockdowns. They knew me before I stood up and made all this noise. And because of that, they really knew who I was outside of the realm of being, the rebel. One thing I never did is I was never disrespectful. I never shouted. I was never insulting. And that is the thing that also saved me, because a teacher will respect you back. They do. Some don't, but the majority, if you treat them with respect, they'll treat you with respect back. And because of that, I remember my dad sent emails in and was on the phone, and like we had a head of behavioural management, SLT, senior leadership team. And he said, well, the thing is, Monty, he's never been disrespectful, and because of that, we've allowed him to kind of get away with what he's gotten away with. I mean, I never wore a mask. I didn't even wear a lanyard. You see, they asked me to put an exemption lanyard on, in which I said no, because I don't see why I should have to single myself out or label myself in any way. That was the kind of the coming to the point of taking the mick a little bit. What I did in the end. Just one thing. So what I did in the end is I actually took the lanyard and I clipped it onto my belt in front of my crotch. So when I walked in the morning, they said to me, "Where's your lanyard? You're going to have to stay in my office. We can't." I said, "I do have my lanyard on, sir." I unbuttoned my blazer and I flashed in my crotch. And as you'll know, within education, things like that, it's very sensitive how teachers can be around students. Like you can't even be in the same room as just a teacher on your own. So because they stopped asking me, full stop. So that was my clever sort of way around it.
Well, so you've learned creativity and resilience at the same time, which is powerful. Mike, I want to ask you. Obviously, within the school you're in, you're leading the school, you've got your own views on this. But what about the educational authority? How did it's really interesting to hear how Monty engaged with other teachers. What about yourself? How was it for you engaging with other teachers and the education authority with your views?
Well, this is the interesting thing. So prior to this time, so I've been a head teacher for 20 years, and in the profession as a teacher for 30. And prior to this time, I could do no wrong really. So I was regularly taught my kids to shoot 410 shotguns, live rounds, skin rabbits, pluck pigeons. We had a herd of water buffalo. Every single child in the school would learn to light a fire and cook over an open fire, so they had knives. So basically guns, knives, fires, animals which frequently escaped, and they weren't like chickens, they were full power, massive buffalo and things. And no one complained. In fact, it was the opposite. Ofsted would say, "Oh, this is fantastic. He's giving kids guns. Brilliant." The Department for Education, the same. It doesn't matter who it was. They were just like, yeah, because it was underpinned, obviously, by the whole sort of character education stuff that I'm kind of really into. And they could see that the kids were getting good results and everything else. But it was the kind of subject matter which you would be forgiven for complaining about because it's a bit emotive, etc. But it was only when I first started. It was initially about lockdowns. I was like, oh, I've got a feeling that this is going to have a negative impact on the economy, and then in the future that will affect the most vulnerable in society, including our children. And simultaneously, the COVID vaccine rollout to children, which I'm still blown away that I'm the only head or school principal out of more than 20,000 to actually publicly question that. And there are loads who agree with my stance, by the way, but they are too scared to say anything about it. But going back to your question, after having had such a successful career, which was supported brilliantly by the local authority and others, that's when I came under fire. It was the particularly the sort of sacred cow of the pandemic, the vaccines. Question those, and that is the highest of this most blasphemous thing you can do. And so my employer received anonymous complaints, 3 anonymous complaints consecutively over a period of 18 months, and investigated me. Or rather, they commissioned independent investigations into my conduct, each one more intense than the previous one. Finally, a complaint was raised under Prevent, which is the government's counter-terrorism strategy, and I was reported to the Department for Education Counter-Extremism Division. So I was framed as a terrorist for my lawful and moderate views, and all of the people, all of them across the board who had previously supported me, then considered, as far as I'm concerned, considered me as public enemy number one for daring to question the narrative. So yeah, it's and then that's that in a nutshell, basically.
If I could just build on something else there, you mentioned about prevent, and that's really interesting, because just as you were talking about prevent, I was just thinking, I've connected with as many students as possible who had a very similar approach to me, and I know an individual who was a student and he got referred to prevent and was treated like a terrorist just for the fact that he stood up and said exactly what we're saying. And what's really interesting about what my sort of stages throughout the education system is I went back to school in year 10, then I had year 11, but then I went to college. I left school and I went to college. So I've seen college as well, that environment. And then obviously by the time I finished college, any COVID restrictions within schools, well, any posters I'd taken down, so that had all gone as well. I've also, well, we could touch on this maybe a bit later in this conversation, but I've also very, very recently been, I would say, forced out of university because of rejecting other ideologies in regards to the whole trans pronoun stuff as well. So I've seen kind of apart from primary school, I've seen every possible approach different stages of education take to students and how teachers or lecturers respond to that. And it's just really refreshing to hear your take on it as well. Very interesting dynamic. What
interests me with you is your immunity, like mine. Somehow we have been immune to the PSYOP, because it's like you touch on prevent. We now know that the counter disinformation unit, which would have normally been looking at foreign adversaries and your classic terrorists like ISIS, etc., were eyes off them and eyes on us. So anyone questioning the government narrative on COVID. The same goes for, we now discovered with MI5 and MI6, not exclusively, but to a large degree. And we know that there was this intention. So it's not like just an organic thing where teachers were like, oh, I think that person might be an extremist, I'm going to report them. They were encouraged to do so. And the conditions and the landscape that we're in was set to basically view anyone who was in the most moderate, because just to say with me as well, I've been massively careful to make sure that all of my messaging has been aligned to very reputable people, mainstream media stuff as much as I possibly can, because I've always been thinking, right, I need to appeal to parents who have the complete opposite view to mine, or who may be in the balance. So there's no point in like red pilling people, because you just put them off straight away. Whereas if you kind of go in with just the basic facts about things and say things in a moderate manner, then you can, get through to people. But the interesting thing is, even that was enough to trigger those kind of COVID evangelists to go like, no, burn him, sort of thing. So, but it interests me that you and I, and obviously a decent amount of, decent sort of percentage of the population, are those who somehow immune to the PSYOP. And I think that would be a really interesting thing to do some research about. It's like, okay, critical thinking obviously is part of that, but what else is it? I just find that fascinating.
I can say definitely on my part, being 14, it'd be very arrogant of me to stand here. Well, so being 18, but talking about when I was 14, it'd be very arrogant of me to sit here and say, oh, well, I worked it all out on my own. I mean, my father is a highly educated philosopher, and my mum is a highly educated psychologist. So when you combine those two kind of professions, that sort of deep thinking side of things with my dad, talking about morals, he's also very scientifically minded, very, very intelligent in that regard. 100%. Yeah. I mean, my mum my mum and dad are on it. And my mum, because you mentioned nudge theory. So my mum was as a psychologist, was on it straight away, understood the idea of fear tactics, and that was passed on to me. So in regards to how I woke up, in regards to my approach at being at 14, it's just listening to what is quite obvious, really. I see it as obvious until I went into school and realised, oh, clearly it's not that obvious. But yeah.
Would your dad have long monologue? Because it's like I've got a now 19-year-old and a 26-year-old, as well as my 6-year-old twin daughters. But the older two would be subjected to my nighttime monologues, ranting about everything. So there was no escape, really.
I would come home and it would be well, at the time it was Lockdown Skeptics was the go-to. It's now the Daily Skeptic, as you know, but before it was Lockdown Skeptics, and there's been another article on Lockdown Skeptics. Come on, son, we're going to read it. And it was be about mask mandates, etc. Yeah, it was every day, relentless. But you had to be like that, because if you're going to, I always get very frustrated with people who are very quick to express their opinion and be very forceful, not wear a mask, but that's fine to do that, just as long as you can stand your ground and say why. It's really important you have that evidence to back up your points.
But that's the other thing.
It sounds like you were a first. Sorry, Mike. Yeah, carry on.
I was just going to say there's the additional element within you, which I really admire, which is the ability within a highly pressurized, particularly being 14 as well. So peer pressure is difficult enough as, you know, when you get into adulthood, but as a 14-year-old, that's your classic like full power peer pressure stuff, let alone the hierarchy of the school system that you're in, etc. And for you to intelligently rebel, and I say intelligently because you weren't just like, oh, get lost. You know, you were saying you were polite to the members of staff and saying, no, I'm just not going to kind of conform. But to be able to, so what I'm trying to say is, like, you had your influences from home, which are great, but actually a massive amount is credit to you, because to take that into then that incredibly pressurized, highly intense environment and still be able to stand your ground is like massive respect to you for that. That's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to add to that because, you know, you obviously took a very strong stance and you've shared how you communicated with the teachers, but did you manage to rally support amongst any of your fellow students, even if they weren't vocal about it? Did it become a bit of a clan, or you were the lone warrior throughout this?
So I can. One thing that's very, very. I've got a very, very good friend. You may know his name, Ramis, who during vaccination program, he went to schools, played his famous song "Don't Take the Vaccine" and handed out information. It was strictly outreach. And Mike, you mentioned earlier about you can't just go up to a student or a student's parent and just red pill them like quite intensely. You've got to be quite clever about it. And that's what I would do with students. I wouldn't just red pill them and then come to overload them with evidence. I would regularly bring in leaflets, white rose stickers you might be familiar with. I used to stick them around campus. In terms of did I rally up sort of a group of individuals? In the beginning, no. In the beginning, it was just me every single day. But obviously, as time goes on, people begin to listen. And I can tell you now that when I talk about this, I have followers on my social media back when I was at school. And I regularly see them liking my posts. I regularly see them kind of send me the odd message with like a little heart or something, how you can react to messages. What I'm saying is I think that I've earned back a respect that I lost because they've really woken up to sort of what it's all about. I did at one point was making exemption lanyards and giving them out to people. I had a few people started to wear them. I did my best. There's only so much you can do. I didn't, but in a more bigger picture, no, I didn't manage to kind of round up a mob of maybe a dozen people to fight up and say no. Was very, very difficult. But when someone, as I said, the masks was the biggest thing because everyone wore one. And when one person didn't wear a mask and claimed exemption, and I claimed exemption based on physical and mental distress, whatever that means. And it's like a visual representation of being rebellious. And everyone, Mike, you'll know that students love the rebellious ones. It's funny. And in the start they didn't. But when I started in history getting a little bit cocky and saying, look, can you not see the parallels here between Hitler's rise to power or the World Economic Forum, for example? And I started to be quite clever and savvy, and things had kind of relaxed a little bit, and it wasn't so intense. This is kind of in year 11, about a year on. By that point, the intensity of constantly having to battle had switched to sort of, oh, it's Monty's back at it again, you know. And I would send in emails, I would take down posters, and it became slightly different. But that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, I mean, you make such an important point. You know, when I was growing up, you know, the rebels were the cool kids. You know, they were the people that people want to be around, and it seems we're in a generation of almost conformity from the adults to the children. I'm curious, Mike, did you have anyone like Monty in your school? What age were the children you were working with?
So 7 to 11-year-olds. So I mean, loads of kids, like when they're that age, just do what they want. I mean, bear in mind there's a high proportion of special needs kids in the school as well, who, like, you know, completely, particularly like social distancing, all of that would be oblivious to it. But there's no healthy amount of rebellion, and it was really interesting actually, because I kind of had a lot of self-reflection over that time as well, where, because I'm one of my things that I'm good at is behavior management. I don't have to like shout at children or belittle them or any of those horrible ways of doing things. I just kind of got a vibe with the kids and a good personal connection. But if I, say for example, would go out into the walk onto the school stage, everyone would fall into silence and I wouldn't have to say anything at all, you know, that kind of vibe. But it was interesting because as throughout this process, I have actually also reflected on how much that might actually not be such a positive thing. And I remember there was one time over the last 3 years, I was asking the kids to line up outside, and you know, it's like, right, everyone line up, silence, you know, great, getting ready to go in. And there was this one particular boy who was just spinning around at the back of the line, and I was just about to say, "Oi, come on, sort it out and stuff," and then I just checked myself, and I was just like, "Oh my God, actually, this is what we need." And it was quite an interesting kind of inner conflict. The beginning of the end. Yeah. Can I just ask you
something that I used to...
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask you, may I ask you please about the, were you there then when they offered the vaccines, the COVID vaccine to kids in their school sites, and what that was like on the inside for you, if I may ask that question?
So the vaccination program really kicked off for my generation by the time I was in college. So that's like, you know, year 12 in a sense. And we had a big tent, and it wasn't a vaccine tent, it was a testing tent. That's what we had. And you'd be round up. It was like cattle. It was just terrifying. They would say, right, coming for your daily test. And they'd give me one and say, no, thanks. And eventually on my table, I had like a stack up here of all the tests I'd rejected. But in regards to the vaccination, what we had was a serious amount of propaganda. So all the backgrounds on the computers were changed, not from the name of the college or something like that, to get vaccinated now. You know, we'd have these things called personal development sessions, and they would discuss the importance of vaccination and people like me and how we are conspiracy theorists and nut jobs.
So your tutors were telling you this stuff?
Yes.
Jeez, okay.
And I wrote in that they also, what was worse at college is, one thing I had to make a decision. When I went to college, it was like a new set of people. I'd left school, I'd left all of this behind me, and I was thinking, please, let's not have any more of this stuff. I just want to be young and free and just enjoy my time at college and make some friends. And they brought in masks, but not as a government mandate, but as a choice. they chose to bring them in. The actual college chose to bring them in. And I was like, right, you've got no grounds to do this. I'm going to send an email in and I'm going to take them on. What they asked me to do is put a visor on. And when they asked me to put a visor on, I said, well, I ain't doing that either. You don't know me yet, but you'll learn who I am, and I'm not going to do it. After that, it was almost like, all right, I had to make a decision. Do I sort of chill out and just not make such a fuss? I thought, no, I'm going to have to go back at it again. Then I took down all the posters. Then I fought back against all the personal development sessions, fought back against vaccination, sent emails in, never got responses, never got anything clear. But once again, in regards to vaccination, I actually really tried with that, because it's very different to masks, because we know masks are terrible. But I can tell you for a fact, the people in my class spoke to me, young girls spoke to me about how they'd suddenly got menstruation issues. It was very common. Some girls ended up in hospital because of their periods. I had people saying to me, after I should have listened to you, I got this to go on holiday, which obviously is the classic one, and I really wish I didn't. And it's really sad. I used to be very angry at my generation. I used to get really frustrated because I was quite, I was so strident with it. I'd say, it's so obvious. But now, growing up a little bit and looking back on it, I'm not angry, because do you know what? We were very young at the time. It's very easy to just want to take a vaccine and live a quiet life. People ask me, well, why are your generation still so quiet, as though I would say useless, at standing up and having an opinion? And the reason being is they shouldn't be blamed, and they regularly do. But why would my generation want to stand up and speak out as stridently as I do, when they've just had 4 years of their life, effectively their greatest years, disrupted and taken away from them? They just want to, be young. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't stand up. I think that if everyone was to stand up, there'd be a massive shift. But I can 100% understand why my generation just want to withdraw and just be young. I've just not fallen into that category. But yeah, that's how the vaccine, around your question. No, it was not directly administered within my college, but the level of propaganda and demonization of people like me who would turn it down stridently was definitely up there.
Again, this is something which won't be discussed by the COVID inquiry, but which absolutely must be, and it will be something which I know campaign groups like Us for Them will be really pushing. Certain ministers, obviously we've got like Bridgen on our side, but also people like Miriam Cates, etc. I hope will be raising this issue, because the way you described things like that tent that you have to go into to be tested, and earlier when you were talking about with the school environment being herded into these these sort of corridors, and then the propaganda and the indoctrination with regards to the vaccination. I mean, it's absolutely appalling, and you're right with regards to your analogy and your connection with World War II, and the fact that this, the history teacher could not possibly see the similarities, but it absolutely is the similarity. And it reminds me, actually, you talking about this is I remember a piece coming out in 21, no, what was it? Maybe 21, 22. In fact, it was 2022, January, I think. It was a Telegraph piece, and it was called How the World is Turning Up the Heat on the Unvaccinated. And it was subtitle From Prison Fines to No Jab, No Job. It was something like that. And it listed all of the extraordinary things happening globally. Everything from quarantine camps to no jab, no job, to mandatory vaccination being discussed in certain parts of the world, to imprisonment for not paying fines in Austria. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. And it feels like you guys, the young people, the children in the schools, were almost like the test case for that, because there was nowhere as harsh as you guys were getting it, because of course, as I said, it was before and after you went to school as well on public transport. So it's shocking. It must be talked about, and we've got to do everything to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Well, let me tell you something else that I didn't mention, which it's something I always mention, is something that I'm very much against, as I'm sure we can all share a similar sort of opinion, is heavy surveillance. And that, I mean, there's surveillance all over schools with CCTV everywhere. And this is such a good example. And they say, well, we have we put CCTV cameras in for your safety. You know, that old narrative of saying we're doing it to help you. And I would say, no, I don't want surveillance everywhere. And they say, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then you've got nothing to hide. I say, no, because it's what you can use that surveillance for. And what did they use it for? Well, when I went into school, if one person claimed to have a COVID case with their lovely false positive tests, they would trawl through CCTV footage and look at who had been in contact with who, and they'd look at the seating plans of classrooms, and they'd look at who was sat next to who. And in terms of rounding people up like cattle, they'd walk down the corridor, there'd be a knock on the door, someone would come in with a clipboard and a pen, and they'd say, everyone would sigh, and they'd say, I know, me again, can we please have these names follow me through the corridor to the school hall? And you'd be funneled through the corridor, you'd go into the school hall, and that would be the quarantine section. And what's really interesting is I was in contact, I didn't do any 2-meter distancing, and I was careless. And I know for a fact that I was in a classroom surrounded by people with COVID, but they never sent me home. This goes back to the hypocrisy. And the reason they never sent me home is because they know I just walked straight back in. I was never going to do it. So they had I know I was sat next to people with COVID cases, supposedly, and all the class would be disappeared. And I'd be sat there and I'd be like, why am I here? Well, I don't know, Monty, it's a bit weird, isn't it? And I'm like, well, I know why I'm here. It's because I'm not going to do it, am I? So it's just crazy. And what's even kind of scarier is the psychological impact, as we know, in regards to masks and stuff. But actually looking at younger years, kind of in primary school, is when you're growing and your mind is growing and you're that young, consistency of values, consistencies of morals, and watching how people behave is very important. You know, if your dad turns around to you and says, don't do that, and then you see him doing it later, you think, well, hang on a minute, why has he told me not to do it? And you start to grow up with a kind of a very, I don't know, maybe rebellious or mistrusting approach to your seniors. Because many of the people don't trust their seniors. They don't want to respect teachers. And I think a lot of that is because teachers don't respect the students. And I think especially in the younger years, I can imagine in primary school, watching teachers go and enforce rules and then go and break them. There's going to be a huge, massive disruption and mistrust between students and teachers. I think that's something that I've never actually touched on myself. It's only in this interview that I've really thought about it.
Several things. It firstly reminds me of when you talk about the isolation stuff of, so we would have year groups of 90 children, so 4-year groups of 90 children up to sort of 365. And there was this thing where if a child tested positive, in inverted commas, as you say, the entire year group would have to go home. 90 kids would go home. Yeah. And what you've described and remembered about, you know, like these sort of really obsessive education personnel looking over and scrutinizing CCTV footage to see who was next to who. The amount of time that I saw people, like teachers and senior managers and governors, etc., wasting their time on that kind of stuff for hours and days and weeks on end. And suddenly education didn't really matter. All the stuff that we were actually meant to be about didn't matter at all. It was all, and it was always this thing of, oh, we've got to protect ourselves, or, you know, like protect the adult. It was using children as a shield. And that's reminded me of you know, I know it's a bit probably politically incorrect to say, but it's like that teachers, like very few adults seem to take much responsibility for their health. There's a lot of rather overweight people, for example, and quite a number within the teaching profession as well. And that's something that kind of irritates me, because I just think, well, you know, if you want to kind of like protect yourself and look after your health, don't use kids and like inject them, put them in masks and do all of that kind of weird stuff. Just go for a jog every day and don't eat all the pies. Do you know what I mean?
My science teacher was morbidly obese, and I'm not afraid of just saying that publicly. And she was fanatical about following the COVID policies. Like, she's the one that said don't put a fan in the classroom because she'll get ill from COVID. Finally, she did go off with COVID, and she was absolutely fine. Good job. I think she had 3 vaccines or something by that point, so that probably what saved her. It's just, once again, it's following that narrative of complete hypocrisy.
Well, in fact, Mike, whilst you're talking about that, I'm curious about some of the most absurd things you saw in primary schools, because we've heard a little bit about secondary education, and there was, you correctly identified, there was a distinction, thankfully, to some degree in the UK, but sending entire classrooms of young children at their earliest formative years home.
There were the absurdity of things like the whole year groups having to go home because one child tested positive. I was actually sent home. It's like, this was a mad one. So I had a 10-minute conversation. So I'm not vaccinated against COVID, surprise, surprise, because I don't fall into that group and they don't work and all the rest of it. But I had a 10-minute conversation meeting with a member of staff who's double jabbed, and she's really lovely and cool, mate of mine actually, and respects my views and so on and so forth. But this was noticed by certain senior people within the school that had this meeting, and the following day, this member of staff tested positive for COVID and rang me up and said, I've tested positive for COVID. It's like, oh, yeah, fair enough. Right. Thanks for letting me know. Not that it really bothered me. And then I had a phone call from other senior people later saying, right, because you're unvaccinated, if you had been vaccinated, you would now be going home to isolate for 7 days. But because you're unvaccinated, you have to go home for 10 days. And I said, right, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to do it. But by this point, I was already on my second, having been investigated for the second time, and all these kind of, even though I was cleared across the board with regards to my right to free speech, the heat was on, and I was like in trouble. And then it was my chair of governors who showed me that it was not just like guidance, it was law. And that if I was going to then break the law on school property by staying on site, I would then obviously face consequences. And it's that kind of, I mean, I was livid about that because it was totally unnecessary. And it's interesting, actually, I'm sure we've all found this, but the colleagues, friends, family I know who have been vaccinated at least once and most multiple times have also had what they call COVID multiple times since. And the people I know who are unvaccinated simply haven't had it. I mean, it's kind of bizarre. So there's all those sorts of contradictions and kind of weird stuff. But I think it's things like sort of weird stuff like, different signing in books for members of staff before they came into school, children not being able to share reading books, all manner of kind of like just sort of full on restrictions. Thankfully, as you say, with the absence of compulsory mask wearing, unlike the children in the US. However, the kids in East Sussex did receive, this is primary age children from 6 upwards, they did receive a letter addressed to them advocating and singing the praises of the COVID vaccines. So there was a lot of that kind of like coercion going on. And I'd like to just point out, actually, it's interesting because the 5 to 11 year cohort, only 10.5% of our nation's children actually ended up receiving the COVID vaccine. So almost 90% of that cohort did not get the vaccine, which means that it's reasonable to assume that parents made the decision that the risks outweigh the benefits. I think that's reasonable to assume. And then with the older ones, the 12 to 15, it's something around 40% or something like that. But the point being, the vast majority of parents, despite the huge push and the propaganda and the coercion and all the rest of it, the vast majority of parents elected for their child child and children not to receive the vaccine. But that's where we come on to what I think is the most chilling aspect of the whole pandemic. This didn't happen in my school, this was in secondary schools, but the vaccination of children against COVID-19 on their school sites, and with the possibility and the permission to be able to do that without parental consent. So Sajid Javid said, if a dispute arises and a child wishes to have the vaccine and the parent doesn't, the child's decision will overrule the parents. Now, that has got to be the most chilling aspect of the pandemic, and something, again, which I think really needs to be discussed.
I've got a question for you, Mike. I mean, you were in primary school. How do you think you would have responded to being a secondary school headmaster? Do you think you would have lasted very long? Or do you think you would have had to, because obviously it's a slightly different kettle of fish, you'd have to really be imposing some rules which are quite horrific in my opinion. How do you think you would have dealt with that?
So it's interesting because despite my kind of maverickism and the like kind of mad stuff like I've done, like the guns and all the rest of it, I've done all of that in a very strategic way, actually, and it's premeditated, and I've taken calculated risks. Obviously, there's an element of risk, but it's something which I've done, which has, and I've had a passion for those things. Things like vaccines and stuff. I've never previously had any interest in like the pharmaceutical industry or anything, because my family's well, it's like I'm healthy and all of that kind of stuff. It's never really been an interest of mine. And when this all kind of kicked off and I found myself speaking out, first of all, felt like the logical thing to do, just to be able to, at the beginning, before we started getting attacked, it was just like, okay, this feels like a reasonable thing to express my opinion about. But once I came under pressure, and once I was repeatedly investigated and all of that kind of stuff, I actually surprised myself with how I was able to stand up and fight my corner, because it's not like I've been strong in every aspect of my life historically at all. That's not been the case. I just feel like this was my red line. So I would hope that if I was in a secondary school setting, I would be exactly the same. I don't know, but I think having been through it now, I would think that would be the case. But I'm just saying that it was, particularly when I was told at the beginning, right, although you have a right to lawful free speech and you can carry on, we are going to tell you, we think you should stop. And something within me clicked, and I just ramped everything up. And that's what happened every single time, because I felt, right, in the absence of any other head teacher or school principal articulating their concerns, it does fall on me. And although, and I've sacrificed a massive amount in terms of career, reputation, finances, relationships, you name it, across the board. But I just think there are some things that, for me, I've discovered that where I'm like, okay, that's my red line. And I know it's become a bit of a cliche to talk about that thing of, who would you have been in Nazi Germany? Would you have been one of the silent ones who would have gone along with it? Would you have been one of the ones to have, actively taken part in the atrocities, etc., etc.? Who would you have been? And I now know that I would have been someone who would have been actively resisting.
Well, what you're saying is the something my dad used to tell me when I was a little boy, before all of this, of course. He used to say, Monty, just understand the majority of people in this world are idiots. And he used to say, oh, Dad, come on. And then when lockdowns happened and masks came in, Dad went, I told you, this is a perfect example of the majority of the people in the world are idiots. And he said, he said to me, it sorted the wheat from the chaff, and it showed us who the majority of people really are, and people's personalities and the way their psychology is formed. Something I want to try and pull up, it's on my Twitter, as you referenced vaccination for children. I'm just going to see if I can my camera might turn off, I'm not sure. No, it's okay. I just want to read the letter that I was given in regards to taking my COVID-19 vaccination, because it is a very chilling letter, and it's just disturbing. So if I just read just a little bit of it. So it says, Dear Montgomery Toms, we've sent you this letter and you're now able to take your coronavirus vaccination, etc. How you get vaccinated? The most chilling part is at the end, where it says, if I just quote it directly, bear me 1 second. It says, you do not need the permission from your parent or guardian to take the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, that letter is given to me I was 16 at the time, but it would have been given to children or teenagers who were younger. And it's the fact that they blatantly undermined people, parents and guardians, in a letter to take a COVID-19 vaccine, which is separate to education. It's, obviously government body, NHS as well.
The whole thing I've witnessed is undermined all of the basic ethical and moral standards that we've held dearly for a long time. And I think this is why it's created such a response, because it's so all-encompassing. And, we've seen how the ethics committees were basically thrown out and alongside the ethics themselves. And the challenge is the old adage of what you permit, you promote. And if we don't take a stand now against these things, then it will become normalized, and not just normalized, it will become moralized. As we saw, policies were moralized in order to get people to feel a sense of civic duty during the course of this period, therefore strengthening those group bonds, or the tyranny of the majority, to put it in a way, what you've just said, Monty, in a slightly different term. And this is why I think these conversations are so important. So we catch ourselves at the precipice of these things. And many of us have been active from very early on during this to warn against these things and do everything that we can. But in the wake of what's gone before us, I think it's really important that we continue to do the work to clean up the mess that has been left from this COVID chapter, in order that we do not see these things unfolding again. Because already we're seeing with other childhood vaccination schedules is the same message, is that if your children decide they want to take it, and bear in mind, you can't drive a car or buy an alcoholic drink, but you can make a life-changing medical decision and get a tattoo. But you can take a vaccine without. I mean, how is a child meant to understand the pros and cons?
It's the same when looking at, this is something I wanted to touch on because I've spoken about my journey in school, college, and now looking at university, which I have to admit was very short-lived. It didn't last very long at all. But it's the same thing when looking at things like transitioning gender to gender. This people's approach to children is just bizarre to me, how it's shifted. And I went into university full of optimism. I didn't keep I wasn't as vocal, and I kept myself going quite chill, because I thought, I'm now choosing to go into education. I could leave, but I want to get a degree and things like that. And I was forced out before I was before I got kicked out. I left before they had that conversation with me. And the reason I'm mentioning this, the reason it's important, is because children are conditioned as young as primary school these days to believe in these things. And by the time they get to university, you're dealing with adults now, and you're dealing with people who are completely consumed, and they are very, very stuck in their ways in regards to their approach to COVID-19, transgenderism, woke ideologies, so many things. And like, for example, I was given a piece of paper. It's also on my Instagram as well. I recently uploaded it, which so divisive. And it said to me, it's their list of rules that they give you. Basically say, these are the rules of the campus. It's the rules of our institution. If you don't follow these, you'll be put through disciplinary action. And one of them is check your privilege. And it says, it's basically suggesting that because I'm white, if I'm talking to somebody who's mixed race or black, then I have to be aware of the fact that there are micro hierarchies within the Western society, which means that I can come across as more privileged. Or it says, please check people's pronouns before you engage in conversation with them. Don't be a misogynist. Like, don't be a misogynist. Why are you telling grown men this. And it's like if I say to you, don't think about penguins, the first thing you think about is penguins, you know, even though I said don't think about them. And if you give someone that piece of paper on day one, I was thinking, I'm not going to last here. And then I went out, because I do a vast amount of activism. I'm on the street regularly on a megaphone, handing out information, trying to muster up as much trying to muster as much outreach as possible to try and spread my message and try and get through to my generation. And they didn't like that, and it was just, I was forced out.
In both cases, what we've identified here is ideological capture of an academic institution, which is not conducive to the free flourishing of ideas when it's become so prescriptive. And I think this is the concern. I think what the sad part is for both of you, because we'll talk to you now, Mike, because you've both voluntarily left at the education setting for different reasons, or similar reasons, really, before someone has pushed you out. And so, Mike, tell us about your story. You resigned. You're now taking legal action. Really curious to know what led to those decisions and what the latest is on your legal case.
Just wanted to pick up, though, first of all, we were talking, so I was slightly distracted. There's regarding the so we've been talking a lot about the sort of byproduct of policy, etc., and what it looked like, you know, masks and this, that, and the other. But we now are discovering over time some of the reasons why those things, how they came about. So things like the psychological nudge unit, things like the counter disinformation unit, which I made a subject access request to the DCMS, and I'd been monitored by them. I was on their kind of terror watch list, etc. We know about the intelligence agency's involvement. Molly Kingsley and her husband, Ben Kingsley, and Arabella Skinner, in their new, a brilliant book, is called The Accountability Deficit. They have exposed this this unbelievable vibe of the government's own ethics committee being shut down as soon as they started to question the COVID vaccines for children. So we're looking at, like, you know, very sophisticated, you know, when you include MI5, MI6, etc., like the really, really sophisticated psychological manipulation and coercion, which has led to these sorts of things happening. But then, of course, you've then got the question of, like, well, yeah, but then who's pulling their strings? And that's where it's interesting when you look at sort of the woke stuff within universities, and it's everywhere. And certainly within, like, schools, I've had the kind of this realization with regards to the sex relationship education curriculum that a lot of teachers are themselves from the TikTok generation, and I've spoken a lot about how over time the intellectual requirement to become a teacher has been reduced considerably. So back like 30 years ago, when I was when I came into the profession, you know, we were sort of interrogated intellectually, and there was a need for and a requirement to be a critical thinker. And we'd studied Vygotsky and Piaget, etc., and the Russian thinkers. And it was, you know, you had to have a grounding and an interest in educational research and philosophy. And if you went into a staff room and listened to a conversation back in the day, it was about education. Now you go into the staff room, they're talking about X Factor on Love Island, yeah. So you're talking about like a group of people who are less kind of intellectual, and who are very susceptible to what is actually a Chinese Communist Party platform, TikTok. And I think it feels that like our institutions have been infiltrated by groups and individuals who do not want the best for our nation. I think the CCP is part of that, but then you can talk about WEF, etc., etc. Now, going back to your question, I just wanted to quickly say that. Going back to your question, after I was reported as a terrorist, and you know, they've had the third investigation, and by the way, for the third time, I was cleared with regards to my views, my public views about the COVID vaccines for children. I asked my employer, look, are you going to just repeatedly investigate me for the same thing every single time an identical complaint comes in, i.e., oh, Mike Fairclough's been challenging the vaccines, bearing in mind that the COVID vaccination for children is ongoing now. It hasn't ended. The offer has gone to children with ADHD, who are on with ASD, children who are in quote vulnerable families. I mean, it's such a broad thing. It's basically continuing. The rollout's continuing. So I said, look, I'm going to have to keep speaking my mind about this, because I feel it's not just my moral duty, but as a head teacher, I have a legal duty to safeguard children against harm, and me being silent out of fear of reprisals isn't something that's going to happen. And unfortunately, my employer said we can't rule out future investigations. So I constructively dismissed myself from my school. I connected with Toby Young of the Free Speech Union, and the Free Speech Union are representing me legally. I've got the Chief Legal Counsel, Bryn Harris, on side. I've got the UK's leading civil liberties barrister, Paul Diamond, representing me on behalf of the Free Speech Union. And we are taking my employer to court next November, the 5 days set aside in November 2024. And if anyone's interested in this, they can look up Democracy 3.0 if they want to support that case and see where we're going with that. But it's an important case, because it's not just about, oh, poor Mike, he was picked on at school and ended up losing his job. It's the wider issue of free speech within the workplace, and also the state suppressing opposing views. So within our claims, which includes harassment, discrimination, preventing me from making a protected disclosure, and constructive dismissal, is this whole idea of the counter disinformation units and the intelligence agencies. And we will be making applications to senior ministers. It may include Matt Hancock, it may include Ben Wallace, it will definitely include MI5 and MI6, and we want this to go big in terms of setting a precedent for free speech in the UK, because this is with all of this stuff that's been going on with this, the stuff that Monty's talked about with the treading on eggshells about X, Y, and Z, and all of the kind of COVID stuff. What's really clear is that our democracy and our freedoms are under attack. What's also equally clear is that people are now self-censoring out of fear of reprisals, which is a really chilling thing, because if people want to say something and it's lawful, they should be able to say it, but people are being kind of encouraged to not do that. And it feels like an opportunity, this case, to really set the precedent and to kind of shine a spotlight on all of that stuff.
Yeah, Mike, well, best of luck with that. We'll be tracking that through all the way through. And we'll put the links to the case in the show notes and description. Such an important case for all of the things we've discussed today, because if we lose that right to speak freely under these types of conditions, then the consequences are exactly as we've just discussed. Now, Monty, you've left an educational setting as well by your own volition because of what you were facing, but you're still on the streets taking action. So what's your path to justice here? Because again, your education is being curtailed. Mike's had his career curtailed because of his views. What's your path?
That's a really good question. So many, I spoke to obviously a few people. What should I do in regards to uni? Many said I should stay because it's almost like I'm letting them win. But I realised that would be my own vanity getting the best of me. I don't need to prove to anyone that I can do it. It would be 3 years of a very difficult and stressful journey. I'd rather spend 3 years working on myself in a different capacity. So I'm no regrets as to why I left. In regards to how do I find justice and how do I feel that I am respected for and there's an element of recognition for what I had to go through. Well, you're right. I do a tremendous amount of activism. I'm doing my best to sort of network and build a platform for my experience through lockdowns and COVID, because I'm not so much interested in taking on the teachers and the education system as much as I'm interested in just shaking up my generation and making them feel that it's so easy. Because one thing I forgot to mention is when they said to me, you always use this as an example, when they said to me, we would like you to go and take a test, I looked at them and said one word, no. And they went, okay. And it was as simple as that. For other things, yeah, mask mandates, it was a bit of a battle. But what I'm saying is, I always say this, is there's my generation. They say, well, why don't they share your opinions? I say, I don't want them to share my opinions. I want them to have an opinion. And that's the real problem, is my generation have been led down a path where they're tired of having an opinion. They don't want one. And I say, no, it doesn't matter what it is. I can disagree. You can disagree. As I say, I strive for freedom, but at least have one. I'm not, as I say, my biggest concern is the real grassroots of the problem is in primary schools and secondary schools, and my generation, obviously younger than me, and the generations younger than me, and them going through and waking up and fighting back against the mainstream narratives. If I can get my generation and build some sort of an environment and platform where they don't feel alone. There's a great organisation which I'm a part of called Students Against Tyranny, run by an individual called James Harvey, which they've got a good website, and it's a network of young minds, and we meet up and we do our own things as well. But it's about building that kind of safe platform for people to know that there are individuals like me. As every year goes by, I will get older and I'll become more detached from being able to say, I am young, I was just in the education system. So really, I need to be very full on at the moment, because I can claim that title. I can say I've literally just come out of education. I'm still in touch with that environment. So that's what I'm trying to do at the moment.
Well, I would like to conclude by asking you both, because you've both been put in a circumstance. Monty, as a 14-year-old, where you are finding your feet in life, and you've taken the mantle on here, and Mike, a well-respected teacher who, at a point in your career where you're writing books, you're flourishing, and then all of a sudden this happens, and you've got a whole legal case on your hands. You've both clocked up a bit of experience when it comes to challenging the narrative. So I'm curious what advice you would give to people at home or other people, because it doesn't matter what issue. I think the important point you've made there is, Monty, is have a view, and no matter what the issue is, if there is an injustice or something like this that we face again, then we need more and more people who are willing to stand up. So, Mike, I'll come to you first. What have you learned about yourself in standing up here that you can share with others?
I'm still in the process of discovering that. I've my fallback, because I won't be able to get another head teacher role until I've been vindicated in the courts, and even my publishers are not willing to proceed with the new books that I want. So I've written 3 books already. I've got a 4th one which I'm working on. So I've set up a Substack. You can Google it, Mike Fairclough Substack, and there I'm exploring, partly as my own process, what can we do about this issue of self-censorship? How can we empower others to speak their mind? Now, it might be a view which is completely different to mine, and it doesn't have to be on the global stage or something like that. It might be with a partner or within a work context or whatever. It's like, what is required? And it's interesting, because it feels like a lot of my educational ethos that I've developed over the years, specifically around resilience, the building of resilience and moving out of the comfort zone, that's all now feeding into this new kind of thought process and thinking. But I do feel like I'm sort of on a spiritual journey as well, which I'm still looking for answers on this time. And it's not that I don't have moments where it's just not great, because I'm thinking, wow, taking a lot of hits, etc. But what I've likened it to, and what I've written about, is the mythological hero's quest. So if we look at, say, Homer's Odyssey, or any of those ancient mythologies, where at the beginning the central character is at first reluctant to set foot into the quest. They're always reluctant, and we all have that kind of inner resistance before we have to do something, and then we weigh up, okay, what's best, to stay within the comfort of the known and then wait for the perils to reach our doorstep, or step out into the quest and try and do something about it. And I think using that model, and also the idea, which is across all mythologies, that as you quest, you discover things within yourself that weren't already there. So, like, in answer to your question, I was already fairly resilient because, like, I've had a lot of close personal bereavements in my life, including my first wife suddenly dying, and she was the biological mother of my kids and stuff like that. So I've kind of like been to sort of hell, sort of, as it were, and that's been kind of like my benchmark for bad stuff to happen. But nonetheless, I've still had to dig deep to find even more resilience during this period. So there's been that element. I think my gratitude for the things that are going well and that I do have has increased as well. So, like, the health of my current family, the support of my brilliant wife. She's called Sandeep Sitara. She's a Punjabi Indian warrior woman who regularly kicks my ass when I'm like not stepping up. And so I think there's all those sorts of things, but I haven't concluded this journey. I feel like I'm nearly there, and there's going to be this next bit. But absolutely, as you say, particularly with things like the already signing of the WHO treaty, and then the international health agreements, etc. All of those things, those terrible things, those quarantine camps, those, threats of mandatory vaccination, all of that just around the corner. So now is the time to be tooling up and to empowering others who are reluctant to speak out, to talk about controversial and politically sensitive things.
Well, I would quote what my good friend Ramesh said to me when I first met him in person, and it's a very good one to just simple but a good basis. And it's, if there's 1 million people all turning around to you and saying yes, still say no if you feel that is the answer you want to give. And it's as simple as that. Yeah, I am unable to connect with people because it's sort of, in this regard, because it's sort of ingrained into my makeup and personality. I don't know where I get it from, but I have no quarrels or qualms with standing up and being different. Like, I really don't care what anybody thinks of me. Sometimes that, it can be a blessing, sometimes that can be a curse. But it means that, I've been able to stand up so stridently, and if anyone's very aggressive towards me, or I've got so many people all taking me on at once, it doesn't really affect me too much. Really, I can go away and continue, because, and that doesn't mean to say be arrogant or borderline narcissistic in that regard. It's just about having those dialogues, is what I would say. And if you truly do believe something, and if there's a real solid basis for believing that, really stick with it, and fundamentally broaden your horizons through conversation and debate. And this is specifically looking at my generation, because that is what they don't do. I have to say, it's kind of a quite split. I'll see people who will just have no room for wanting to engage with me positively, and then people who say, listen, I don't agree with what you're saying, but hear me out. I'll hear you out. That's all. I think if we had that, then we wouldn't have locked down. I would go as far as that. If you had that just organic balance and respect, then we would have been in a very different situation. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Monty. And it reminds me of one of my early mentors used to say to me, we spend our whole lives trying to fit in, yet we were born to stand out. And it's, we've become afraid to stand out. We've become afraid to stand up for fear of what it may lead to. But the reality is, if you're in a herd of people, in a crowd of people, the easiest way to stand out is to walk away from the crowd. It's having the courage to do that.
It's hard, but when you become a bit of a professional at it, as I think a lot of people these days have, it gets easier and easier.
Well, everything comes easier with practice. So keep walking the walk, keep speaking the talk, and we'll create change. Mike Fairclough, Montgomery, Toms, this has been a fantastic discussion as we've explored the lost generation, or the children of the revolution. Exploring, I mean, there's so much more we could have talked about here. I'm deeply curious to think about the impact on the generations to come. Will they be impacted by this, and how will they be impacted by this? For people like Monty, I'm sure create a really positive trajectory, but for some, what are the consequences of those policies? That's perhaps a conversation for another day. But I want to thank you both for your inputs today. Such a fascinating conversation here on the Pandemic Podcast. Myself, Dan Astin-Gregory. We've referenced several links during the course of this conversation. You'll find them below this video in the description. Do take a look at that. Do look out for the legal case, and for Mike's Substack and Monty's Instagram and Twitter account, or X account that we're talking about. And you'll be able to find out their onward path from here. So thank you very much, gentlemen, and very much look forward to seeing your onward journey. Yeah.